What is critical race theory and why is it such a big issue today? On this channel, I've had a number of conversations about critical race theory and on race. In fact, I think I've had 6. 3 you might say would be a little bit more to the left and 3 more to the right on issues of racial justice and critical race theory. Well, today we have Neil Shenvi, who is one of the most well-known critics of critical race theory. He's probably read as much on this over the past 5 years as anybody that I know. And I ask him a lot of the tough questions. What do we mean by critical race theory? Why is this important? Can it just be used as a tool? Is this a diversion from real racial justice we should be working on today? Neil Shenvi brings a real understanding to these issues, but also a compassion and a commitment to people and to the scriptures. So I hope you find this helpful. We recorded it in a hotel room, about to head to a conference together, so it's not my normal background, but I think you'll find the content is just helpful and excellent and clarifying amidst confusion. If you enjoy it, consider sharing with a friend. Here's Neil Shenvi and I talking about critical race theory. All right, friends, we've got an important conversation for you today, and it centers on one of the most controversial issues today within and without the church. It's the topic of critical race theory. We're going to explore what is critical race theory, what has the left gotten right about it, what has the right gotten right about it, how should Christians approach and respond to this topic. And I have with me someone who clearly, if you follow these conversations, has made a name, not for yourself in the sense of you're building a name for yourself, but you have establish yourself as someone who's thought about this a lot, cares about it deeply, and wants the church to respond well. And what I like about Neil Shenvi, he's got a Captain America shirt on, so huge props for doing that. By the way, we're speaking at a conference in a hotel room, hence the different background, but first time I've met Neil in person, I thought we've got to have a conversation. So thanks for joining me in room 524 at the Hilton to talk about critical race theory.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Sean.
Well, let's jump right in. And a question I know you get is, what qualifies you to speak about CRT? And I mainly mean your background. You've studied science at Princeton, been at Berkeley. What qualifies you to speak on an issue that's clearly outside of the realm of your expertise and study?
Sure. Well, I have no official training in critical race theory or critical social theory. All I can say is I've read a lot of it for years now, and I do collaborate quite closely with Dr. Pat Sawyer, who has a PhD in education and cultural studies, and actually he kind of got me interested in this subject years ago when we first met because he was describing his own dissertation work. He's now on faculty at UNC Greensboro. When I began listening to it, I said, hey, this sounds familiar to ideas I'm seeing creeping into evangelicalism. So he's really guided my reading. We've written many articles together. And so I always bounce my ideas off him to make sure I'm getting things right.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, it's clear to me you've researched this a ton and thought about it really well. So why do you speak on this issue? Given your science background, I imagine you could speak on vaccines, climate change, evolution. Why this issue and why now in the sense of the last maybe 2 or 3 years or so?
So it went back to about 5 years ago. I began noticing this theological drift in people that I knew personally and in public Christian figures, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. And I was very apolitical. I am kind of apolitical, frankly. I care much more about showing atheists that the gospel is true, that Christianity is true, the Bible is reliable. So, fighting the culture wars was not something I was, I didn't want to do that at all.
Okay.
But I became concerned because of theological issues that were being raised and that I saw coupled to these concerns about social justice. So that's how I got involved in this. And as the years have gone on, I think my early interest has been proven to be relevant and worthwhile.
Okay. So how should evangelicals approach critical race theory? And we were talking beforehand about an article that I wrote, 6 or 8 months ago. And I kind of made 3 C's. I said we should read original sources clearly to understand them. Mm-hmm. Second, charitably, not to find areas of disagreement to quote or misquote. And then third, critically. So let's understand, let's be charitable, and then critically engage. And I found there's a lot of people on all sides of this debate that have not gone back to original sources and tried to understand first, and then critically engage the ideas. that's the approach that I've tried to take in my own understanding of this issue. Although on my show I've had people from different perspectives come on and share. How do you think we should just approach this issue of critical race theory to avoid some of the politics that you mentioned, where it starts becoming us versus them and a political issue? How as Christians should we approach this?
Your article is very good. I agree carefully, charitably, and then critically afterwards. In my article with Dr. Sawyer in the Gospel Coalition, I guess 2 years ago now, we say that nothing can substitute for having firsthand awareness and familiarity with primary sources.
Okay.
And so we urge people to read books like White Fragility, not because we think it's a good book, but because that way you can get it firsthand. You don't have to rely on secondary or tertiary sources or social media sources to tell you what CRT is. And I would just add the fourth thing, maybe the 0th thing, would be biblically. Right? Always filter all these ideas through the lens of, well, what has God said about these issues? What principles from the Bible are relevant to these topics? And that should frame how we think about everything, whether it's science or social science or anthropology, anything.
Okay. Let's get a definition of what we mean by CRT. Because as I've gone back and I've read some readers, Crenshaw and Delgado, some of these other thinkers, I get the impression that there's no core, simple body of what's even meant by CRT amongst critical race theorists themselves. Then I see other people depicting it in another fashion. And one quote I pull up, it says, there's no canonical set of doctrines or methodologies to which we all subscribe. And that was a huge reader from 1995 about critical race theory.
Yes.
So what is critical race theory?
So sometimes you'll hear people say things like, well, critical theory is just a body of legal scholarship that developed in the 80s and 90s, late 80s, early 90s, that tried to understand the connection between race and law.
Okay.
Now that's true. That's sort of like saying Christianity is a religion that developed in the Middle East. Well, yes, it is, but but Christians believe certain things, right? So I actually asked in one of my debates with Rasul Berry, I asked him, well, would Thomas Sowell be a critical race theorist? Because he talks about race a lot, and he talks about the law a lot, and so is he a critical? And he's like, no, not Thomas Sowell. Okay, good. The point is, not everyone who talks about race and law is a critical race theorist.
Okay.
So if you read certain books, I can give you lists of anthologies that will be sort of very vague in general and say, well, we disagree on lots of things. And yet you'll also find books written by the co-founders of CRT themselves, people like Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gotanda, Mori Matsuda, and they will lay out a set of core tenets of critical race theory. And I think so when I define CRT, I will simply quote those core tenets that are given by the founders themselves to delineate what are these defining elements of CRT in their own words. I often don't even elaborate. So I can list a few of my...
Yeah, I remember in Delgado, I think the introductory text gives like 5.
He has themes. He has themes.
Okay, so talk about that.
Okay, so that thing is his CRT introduction, which is like a seminal introductory text on CRT, lists hallmark themes, how he phrases it in that book.
All right.
But I think the earliest work I've found, written this sort of canonical first work to lay out, they call the defining elements of CRT, lists 6. And I really boil them down to 4. But this is Delgado, Crenshaw, Lawrence, and Matsuda, who, if you know their names, are like the co-founders of CRT.
Okay.
Crenshaw coined the phrase intersectionality, and she coined the phrase critical race theory.
Wow.
If you coin a term, you can define
fair
what
enough.
it means, right? So in that anthology, in the introduction, they list 6 defining elements. Here are four ones you'll find over all the literature.
Okay.
I mean, if you see CRT in education, CRT in legal studies, CRT in the 90s, CRT today, they have these 4 themes. So the first is that racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive. This is a phrase they use. This is not Neil Shenvi.
Okay.
So normal, permanent, and pervasive. Second is racism is concealed beneath ideas like objectivity, meritocracy, and colorblindness.
Okay.
That's 2. Number 3 is that lived experience is critical for understanding racism. That's 3.
Okay.
Then number 4 is that racism is part of interlocking systems of oppression, like sexism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, and these other forms of oppression. So we have racism is normal.
Okay.
Racism is concealed beneath things like color blindness and meritocracy. 3, lived experience is critical, and then 4, racism is just one of many forms of oppression that are interlocking and must be dismantled at the same time.
Okay, let's come back to some of those.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that you go to the original source, define the themes carefully.
Yeah.
One of the criticisms that I've heard from a number of scholars of CRT, Christian or not Christian, is they'll say that evangelicals and conservatives have misrepresented them. Is there some merit to that? Is there a lot merit to that? Do you see evangelical scholars misinterpreting CRT? And you don't have to mention, I'm not calling you to call somebody out in particular, but is there some truth to this idea that we need to be more careful how we define it?
There is some truth to that, but there's also some, I just say that on the one hand, yes. So what happens sometimes is you'll find people attributing to CRT ideas that are part of that larger movement that are certainly found within critical race theorists' writings, and yet aren't those core ideas, right? So, for example, you will find people saying things, a very, very common thing you'll hear in our culture today, in books themselves, written by critical race scholars, is the phrase that people of color can't be racist. Because racism is a system, and because people of color don't benefit from the system of racism, they can't be racist. They can be prejudiced, they'll point out, but not racist, because to be racist, it's prejudice plus power. So that's one thing. Now, does CRT say that? Well, again, it's like saying, what does Christianity say about, like, the rapture? What does Well, some Christians say this, some Christians say that. And so to say, well, Christianity teaches such and such, it's like, well, actually, that's disputed, right? Now, the other thing, too, is that some of these scholars they're quoting are not critical race theorists per se. They will be doing things like critical whiteness pedagogy or critical whiteness studies. You say, well, that sounds very similar. They have all the same lingo, but to a specialist, like, well, that's not canonical CRT. That's not CRT proper. That's an offshoot movement. And so that's where it gets tricky. So I just prefer to be fair to everyone involved. I'm just going to read what they wrote or critique that. The other thing you can do, by the way, because obviously the idea that people of color can't be racist is a very common one, a very popular one. You'll hear it even from Christians who say that. Critique that idea. You don't have to attribute it to CRT or to critical whiteness studies or to critical pedagogy. You can just say, here's the idea. I don't care where it comes from. Is it a true idea? Because then you're removing the discussion from semantics and saying, let's critique the idea. And frankly, the people that in your church say who've embraced that idea have not been reading Crenshaw and Derek Bell. They've been in their knitting club hearing about these ideas. So oftentimes they don't know where the ideas are coming from. So why not focus on the ideas rather than on the labels we use to describe them?
Okay, very fair. So my approach was, let's read it clearly, charitably, and then critically. So you've given us a definition, which is helpful from the sources. Charitably, tell me, what do you think CRT gets right? And as you're thinking about an answer, as I've been just reading a number of writings, there's things that give me pause, but there's also times I stop and I'm like, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that is right on in how they recognize racism, certain power dynamics, and that's often left out of the conversation because in some circles it's totally demonized. What do you think CRT gets right, or at least some CRT scholars point out?
So I've learned to phrase it that way because when you say, what does critical race theory get right? What I would say is that in terms of its core tenets, CRT is fundamentally wrong. And its core tenets are fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. However, critical race theorists will say specific things that are actually true and insightful. So what I do is I say, take these anthologies. I've read thousands and thousands of pages of CRT. I really have. I've counted it up.
I know you have.
But some of the anthologies, I would say, typically I'll read an anthology, 500 pages long, and 60% of the anthology, I'm reading it kind of like, it's kind of off. 60% of the essays are kind of off, and they have some things that are good, some that are bad, but then 20% I'll say, I agree with all of that. Like, here's an example. I read one essay from an anthology by Delgado called Critical Race at the Cutting Edge. One anthology is about Asian illegal immigrants who were brought here illegally to work in the high-end garment industry in Los Angeles. It was all about their life. I was like, what's just describing their life, and what's wrong with that? Well, not really anything. Another example in the same anthology, there's an essay about how the justice who was the dissenting opinion on Plessy versus Ferguson, so he was against that decision, which basically made separate but equal okay. He said, no, it's not okay. Now, that was the decision. So that dissenting justice, this author argued, had a half-brother who was black. And he's like, and he makes the case for it historically. And he says, hey, did that influence how he came to his decision? I'm like, let's just, I don't know. And I've actually talked to a lawyer friend who's also anti-CRT, and he's like, no, I think he's right. Huh. So there you go. I'm like, those are two essays where like this is completely just interesting scholarship. It could be right, could be wrong, but I'm not detecting some secret, subtle, insidious message in it. Then 20% is off the wall crazy. So, and when you read these anthologies, you're kind of like, some of it is clearly wrong. Some of it seems right, and some of it just you can't even tell. But underneath all of those essays is, I would argue, a fundamentally wrong way to think about race, power, oppression, justice, etc. that is going to lead you into some very bad thinking. Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I want to get to some of those fundamental differences that you have. But I was reading an anthology on the airplane on the way here, and I think it was the article by Crenshaw, and she was talking about Martin Luther King's approach to race. And I'm reading this going, this is insightful, this is interesting, this is helpful. So I think you're right. We can read writings like this and find out what do we agree with first, what's positive, and then we can talk about some of the concerns. I get the impression sometimes when it comes to CRT that all sorts of concerns about race get thrown into the bucket of CRT that may or may not belong there. So, for example, a colleague of mine at Biola, Thaddeus Williams, wrote I think a great book.
It's excellent,
Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. And he really uses social justice A terminology and social justice B. And I found that helpful rather than the critical theory language. Does that happen where a whole bunch of ideas are thrown in this bucket of critical race theory that it's kind of like, I'm not sure that's at the heart of what CRT is?
So here's the problem. That does happen, but partially it's the result of the incredible influence that CRT has had on scholarship over the last 20 years. So Crenshaw, Kimberly Crenshaw, again, who coined the term intersectionality, who coined the phrase critical race theory, in one of her articles, I think as a retrospective article looking back in the last 20 years of CRT, at one point says, today, CRT is basically synonymous with race scholarship. That's how influential she thinks it is. And it's true in Delgado's book, Delgado and Stefanchik's book, in the first 10 pages, they proudly boast about how at one time CRT was marginal and no one read us, except for other CRT legal scholars. He says today it's read in English literature classes, philosophers use it, theologians apply it, sociologists, historians. So he's very upfront that it has infected on one hand or influenced on the other hand, but it's suffusing academia. The way that academics think about these topics is very heavily influenced by critical race theory, particularly, but also critical social theories like queer theory, critical pedagogy. So the bottom line is that on the one hand, yes, we should try to be precise and say, well, this is what CRT is in a narrow sense, but in a broader sense, it really has influenced huge swaths of academia. So that's why it gets confusing.
So it sounds to me like, and I've read a lot of your stuff before, seen you've interviewed, that you would see CRT more as a worldview, or at least has certain tenets that are contradictory to a Christian worldview. So first off, is that right? And as a part of that, I want to answer the question, can we just use it as a tool? So for me, as I've studied philosophy, sometimes there's like Marxist theory or queer theory, and I disagree in principle with like Marxism, but their view of human nature and the afterlife, etc. I think it's false. But I also look at it, I'm like, you know what? Marxist theory it gets certain things right about class dynamics. So I'm not afraid to use it as a tool insofar as it goes. So is CRT a worldview as you see it? And would it be okay to just use it as a tool, or would that give you pause and concern as well?
So my main concern would be, one, that Christians who say they're just using it as a tool don't seem to be very clear on where that tool needs to be totally thrown away. And that's number one. So in other words, they say, well, we're just going to use it as a tool. Well, tell me what exactly is really wrong with it, right? Well, I don't know. Well, that's a problem, because it'd be like saying, I'm only going to use Marxism as a tool. Well, where do you find it unhelpful? I don't know. Well, wait. We have to get that straight, because we have to realize there are some very dangerous parts of it. And I would argue the fundamentals are dangerous. Here's an example. And you say, well, is it a worldview or a tool? What I would say is this. If you step back from CRT and say, well, what are even the zeroth order assumptions they're making when they go into the scholarship? Those really are coming from a worldview that is fundamentally incompatible with Christianity. So I'll use their own tenets here. Okay. One of the core tenets of CRT, going back to like the earliest sources I can find, is that racism is one of many interlocking oppressions along with sexism and heterosexism. And in her book, Crenshaw, the Words That Wound book, with Crenshaw, Delgado, Lawrence, and Matsuda, it's like 1994, very early book. Their sixth tenet is these interlocking forms of oppression. And critical race theory does not just want to work within the existing system to fix things, because that'll never really liberate people of color. That it's part of a larger project to liberate all of these groups, whether it's people of color or women or LGBTQ people or anything. And then it's actually not just going to work within existing hierarchies. It's going to, this is their own words, it aims to challenge the very notion of hierarchy itself. The very idea they're hierarchies and norms, ways things ought to be. They're going to challenge that very premise. So that gives you an insight, and that's one of their core tenets. Now, can a Christian view reality that way? Like, we're going to challenge all hierarchies, not just race, but sex, gender, sexuality. All those hierarchies have to be challenged and called into question. I would say, whoa, wait. Then right off the bat, there's a Christian hierarchy of what? God and creatures. That's sort of hierarchical, right? And then within Christian worldview, there are hierarchies of authority, say between the leaders of a church and the members of a church, or the congregation, or within a family, parents and children. Hierarchies are not inherently oppressive. But CRTs, at this zeroth level, they're approaching all hierarchies as systems of oppression, and this is partly because they do draw a lot of inspiration from Karl Marx. So all of these critical social theories originate with Karl Marx. They are different, they're not just Marxism, but they take their lead from him. Because of that, they tend to read all power relationships as oppressive, and they tend to see everything through the lens of power. So again, I would say fundamentally, that's a way to view reality. Right? When you say, I want to see everything in terms of power and oppression, that's a way that answers all your questions. What's my problem in life? What's a solution? How should I think about God? How do I think about other people, my relationships? That's going to color everything. And that's built into what these theorists are saying is part of how they approach their field. So there's just one example of, man, that's really dangerous.
So if somebody understood this, used it as a tool academically in principle, and knew the limits of it, you probably wouldn't have an issue with it. But most people are not aware of the underlying issues at play, don't know how far it goes, and how deeply in tension some of the ideas of CRT are with a Christian worldview.
Well, I think the scholars themselves would say, if you took CRT as a Christian and said, I'm going to only apply this to race, I'm not going to apply it to gender and sexuality, because I think those are different categories. But they would say, no, you can't do that. They say one of our core tenets is, so again, there's a paper that says, I think it's Harper, Patton, and Wooden, they would say, CRT challenges the idea that we can dismantle racism without simultaneously dismantling sexism, heterosexism, ableism, etc. Ibram X. Kendi, who is not a CRT, but he's said he's influenced by intersectionality, he is inspired by it. He has said flat out in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you cannot be an anti-racist unless you are also against homophobia and transphobia. You must be anti-classist. You must be a feminist. In order to be an anti-racist, and vice versa. You cannot be a feminist unless you're an anti-racist. You can't be anti-transphobia unless you're anti-racist. And I'm mispronouncing your name, Bridges' book, CRT, A Primer, also says the same thing. She says, you cannot just be anti-racist, you must also be opposed to all forms of oppression, including homophobia, transphobia, any kind of sexism, classism. So that's not just this weird secondary view to them. That is core to their, the intersectional approach.
Okay.
That goes back to like Crenshaw's famous paper on intersectionality is about how sexism and racism are intertwined and they cannot be separated.
So it's not meant to be just used as a tool, and it carries along with it other worldview baggage that should give Christians pause.
Yeah.
Okay. On my channel, about 18 months I've been focusing on this channel and talk about worldview, talk about apologetics, and have, if I remember correctly, I think 5 times have talked about race. 2 just talking about the church, hearing people's stories, or actually 3, now that I think about it, 3 hearing people's stories, talking about the church, addressing racism, 3 on critical race theory. And whenever I do something on critical race theory, I'll always hear from somebody something like, this is such a distraction. Why don't we just talk about racial justice and how we make things better? And I've heard that enough that it gives me pause and things. The last thing I want to do is just have some academic debate on the side and miss where people are really hurting. And yet, with that said, this is talked about everywhere. There's so much misunderstanding about it. We need some clarity. So you continue to talk about this at the level of idea. I'm sure you've heard that. How do you make sense of that and try to balance out the people that are just hurting and feel like this academic debate is a sideshow from the pain and lived reality of many minorities?
Sure. So one of the things I say, I have an article called How to Preach Against CRT. And one of my theses is you should not even mention the phrase CRT. Don't mention it. Because my point is, if you're concerned about certain ideas, then preach against the ideas that are false and unbiblical. Don't worry about the label. So that, hopefully, if people are worried they're getting tarred with this brush, like you're calling me a critical race theorist, I don't know what CRT even is. I just want to talk about racism. Well, if you don't even use that phrase and just say, well, here's an idea, let's compare it to what the Bible says about these subjects. And, the Bible says these ideas are false, therefore we have to reject them. Well, then you can't possibly be tarring people with that brush if you're not even using that label. And the other thing, too, is that I think in my talks on critical race theory and critical theory more generally, I often talk about racism, lynching, slavery, racism today, racism within the church. I talk about a lot of issues that do resonate with people who have experienced racism, and I want people to have we can do that without invoking any of these bad ideas. And we need to. I've actually just finished, I'm in the middle of reading a book called White Too Long by Robert Jones. And frankly, I think it's a really bad book, but it's very influenced by these critical social issues. But, and it's unfortunately, I say unfortunately because there's some history in it that's tragic, and I wish we talked about more. Like he just describes various lynchings and laws and attitudes within the church in the 1800s, 1700s, 1900s, even today. And I think we need to shine a light on that. I'd love to talk about that stuff. Unfortunately, he takes those very important, helpful discussions we could have and turns them to his purposes, which is basically, I'd argue, liberalizing our theology, which I would not want to do. And that's what so I think as conservative Christians, we need to essentially head that off and say, you know what, I am going to talk proactively about these issues that you're concerned about and show you that we can have that discussion without bringing in these dangerous ideas.
Do you change the way you talk about CRT depending on the audience? Like, I know that you've invited some very conservative audiences and probably some that might be a little bit more mainline. Do you shift the way you talk about it depending on the audience you're speaking to? And if so, how?
So in the past, when I've had more time, the more conservative my audience is, the more I talk about racism, slavery, discrimination, because that's what they need to be challenged with. And then to be fair, when I've given those talks at very conservative venues, they have been glad and outraged like I am. They're like, yes, I agree. This is abhorrent. And they're never like, don't talk about that stuff. They welcome that. And so I generally don't get invited to speak to very liberal people. But I think the key is just to speak about both. Now, obviously, where we land in terms of balance, like how much do you vote to racism, how much do you vote to CRT, it varies. And so people that say, well, you're focusing too much on this and not enough on this, that's fine. I only ask that we condemn both. I always say in my talks, you don't have to choose between condemning racism and condemning the CRT. We can do both. We can reject CRT. We can reject racism. We have to do both. And so I'm very willing to let people fall in different places in terms of the space they devote to both. What I want to insist is we have to reject both.
I love that. I think that's balanced. I think that's right. One of the things that CRT focuses on, as far as I understanding it, is overturning white supremacy.
Yes.
Clarify the different definitions of how white supremacy is understood, maybe how it's understood within CRT, and how you think about it as a Christian.
Okay, so the dictionary will define white supremacy something the belief that whites are superior to other races and ought to therefore have political supremacy over them. Right? That's the definition of the dictionary. And what you'll find is that when it comes to many terms like white supremacy, racism, oppression, justice, critical race theory and other critical social theories have redefined terms. So, and they're very often open about that. They will say, we've redefined this term to mean something else. So the dictionary says white supremacy is a belief that whites are superior to other races and ought to be in charge. But critical race theory understands white supremacy simply to be this system of whiteness as the norm, meaning white culture, white values, white practices. That's the norm in society. That is white supremacy.
Okay.
So it's not a belief that whites are superior. It's simply the existence of these norms, the default human being, the default culture is the white culture, I'll put that in quotes. Now, there's an analog to the patriarchy, which is defined as masculinity being the norm and male values, male norms being the default. Heteronormativity, which is the idea that heterosexuality is the norm. So you see, there's a very similar, all these disciplines, queer theory, critical pedagogy, feminism, and CRT, they're basically the same kind of, the same lens applied to different fields. That's a very rough way to view it. But so now the danger here is that defining white supremacy as whiteness being the norm means that all kinds of things that are morally neutral get thrown into white supremacy. And even sometimes things that are morally good. That sounds shocking, but so some people will question whether or not, say, norms of sexuality, sexual norms are actually part of white supremacy. Because actually they're not. So because all norms are tied together, they're interlocking. So white masculine patriarchy, right, or what is it called? The white heteronormative patriarchy is this vast interlocking system that defines what is valuable, right, normal, and good, what is other and abnormal and of lesser value, right? They're all interlocking. So people will occasionally say even things like monogamy or heterosexuality being the standard, that is actually a function of our white supremacist culture. That's a white, male, patriarchal Western view. So you see how it gets very dangerous to have this really broad category. And obviously it's a very evocative term when you call someone you're complicit in white supremacy. That's really, people hear that and they want to either deny it or refute it. They say, no, I'm not. What can I do to show that I'm not? Well, if the answer is you have to denounce, say, heteronormativity, we have to wait. No, some norms are oppressive, but some norms are God ordained. And so again, you really have to define your terms and approach these ideas carefully because there are minefields there.
So is here an example of how Christians should respond? I've heard the pushback that white supremacy in the church, like how we portray Jesus being white. And growing up white, majority, I didn't really think about it much. That was brought to my attention. I'm like, wow, that does send a message to minorities. It's also not accurate. Like if we care about truth on one level, is that an example you see of kind of a whiteness or potential white supremacy? I don't know if it would fall under that title or not, that the church should be aware of and try to root out.
So it would definitely be termed white supremacy by critical race theorists. That's part. That's the. They would say, see, you're normalizing whiteness because that's why you have white Jesus, because you're exalting whiteness. Now, by the way, I totally agree. Well, I feel uncomfortable with pictures of Jesus, kind of period, not entirely, but it just makes me,
I hear you.
I'm on the fence about those things.
Okay.
But the point is, definitely he's not a white guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. No one thinks that. And so, yeah, I'm totally, when people say, well, we shouldn't be portraying him as a European guy, I'm like, yes, that's true. Yes, definitely. And that obviously is people are subconsciously maybe going to think, well, Jesus is basically just baptizing my culture, the things that I like. I like Christian rock music, and that's holy music, right? Or organ, whatever it is. People tend to, create God in their own image, right? To remake God in their own image. And whites can do that, blacks can do that, Asians can do that. Everybody does that because we're idolaters at heart.
Okay.
But what I'd be careful though is then affixing that label white supremacy to any example of a norm within the white church, within within churches that are predominantly white. Here's an example. There's a book written by someone who's a sociologist, not a critical race theorist. I won't say who she is, but she does a case study of a church that is multi-ethnic. So it's like half black, half white, and the pastor's black. And in the book, she talks about all the racial conflicts in the church. And it's actually a decent book. But at one point, she says, the black pastor had some problems like thinking through, problems in his congregation, getting them to agree on issues of race, right? Mm-hmm. And she said at one point, if he were in the black church tradition, well, see, he would be like the absolute leader and his wife would be like the first lady, and he could have just laid down the law and been like, I'm in charge, you do this. He wouldn't have to deal with a committee of elders.
Okay.
That was her take on the situation. Because the white church norm is having, or some white churches have this council of elders. Okay. So her only thought was, if only he'd followed this non-white model of church. And I was like, wait a minute. The question is not, is this a white model or a black model? Is it a biblical model? That's the question we first ask is, what does God say about how the church should be run? In the same way, oftentimes you'll ask questions, so if you're thinking in this critical race theory framework, whenever you see a norm in the church, and it's sort of typical of a white church, I hate that term, but white churches, you will see that as white supremacy. And then, because that's a negative term, you'll want to dismantle it. But I say, wait a minute, don't do that. That reflex is wrong. The first reflex should be, what does God say about this norm, this structure, this system? Having elders, certain sexual ethics, whatever it is, qualifications for elders, our view of Scripture, our view of the gospel. In all those things, we can't simply say it's white supremacy, therefore we get rid of it. We have to say, what does Scripture say? And that's the danger with applying this label of white supremacy to everything that we see in, again, white churches in scare quotes.
Okay, that's fair. That's helpful. What about Christian nationalism? Why not speak up on that? And I ask because I've had a number of just my minority friends ask me about that. Like, hey, you've done shows on Christian on critical race theory. Why not Christian nationalism? And we've done podcasts on that, etc., elsewhere. But I feel like that's a fair question to be asked. And the impression I get from many of my minority friends, they feel like, okay, wait a minute. I'm getting labeled with critical race theory because I'm speaking out against race or because I hold a certain view of systemic racism. I didn't even know what critical race theory was, 2 years ago or 5 years ago. And they feel like they're getting labeled with this. And I felt like some people said to me, oh, you're a Christian nationalist because I've had a certain guest on my show, because I've spoken at a certain church. And I don't appreciate being labeled and written off and not listened to. And I think many minorities, from what I can gather, feel the same with CRT. What's your thought and your experience? I've seen you have a lot of these conversations, which I appreciate you're willing to do. What are your thoughts on Christian nationalism and kind of these labels that go back and forth?
So I agree 100%. What's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So if you don't like being called a Christian nationalist, you're like, I'm not a Christian nationalist, it doesn't apply to me. Well, then you should be sympathetic to people who say, well, I'm not a critical race theorist, stop applying that label to me. But look, the fairer way is to treat ideas. Rather than calling Sean a Christian nationalist, say, Sean, you said this, that is false, right? I don't care whether you got it from Christian nationalism or you got it from, Better Homes and Gardens last week. It doesn't matter where you got the idea. It's a wrong idea. In the same way, if people say, well, I'm just talking about race. Okay, and I'm not talking about CRT, I don't know what that is. Fair enough, but are you talking rightly about race? Are your ideas about race true or false? I will be glad to divest myself of all these labels and just talk about the ideas. Now, in terms of Christian nationalism, I definitely believe there are people in the U.S. who make politics, their nationality, the United States of America, an idol. There is some shocking statistic that I actually saw. It was, okay, I'll get into this later. Samuel Perry, who's a sociologist at Baylor.
Yeah, I read his book.
I did too. I'll talk about that in a second. Mm-hmm. But there's a figure that was not in that book, but he showed it on Twitter. They polled evangelical Christians and asked them, is the Constitution divinely inspired? And it was like over 20% said yes.
Wow.
Divinely inspired Constitution. And I'm like, either you don't understand the question or you don't understand divine inspiration, what that means for a document to be divinely inspired. But it was, I guarantee it was over 20%. It was shocking, okay? So even if that's half, if it's just 10%, that's too many. So that phenomenon of tying together the United States of America with our God's people, we're God's nation, we're God's chosen nation, that's wrong. Totally wrong and false and I'd just say idolatrous. So if people think that, yes, that is wrong, we should preach against that. We are not God's chosen, the U.S. is not God's chosen nation. The church is God's chosen people, made up of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation. So yes, I'm fine picking out that idea and saying that idea is false and dangerous. There are people today who do mingle the gospel with patriotism. That's bad. But take that book. The book we're talking about is Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead's book, Taking America Back for God.
Yep.
And about a year ago, I was told over and over again, you're fixated on CRT. You should talk about Christian nationalism. Read this book. So I read the book. The problem is I'm going through the data. I'm looking at it. I'm trying to be fair and charitable, as you said. But what I realized from the figures they're showing, they had a survey. They had a Christian nationalism scale. They assigned people based on their answer to these questions. They're either anti-Christian nationalism or they're like a 4 different categories. Like they're very anti, they were sympathetic, they were a little bit anti, they were a little bit sympathetic, or they were very sympathetic.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. They had these 4 categories. They talked about these categories a lot, and they said something like I forget the number. It's like 30% of white evangelicals are the most radical Christian nationalists, the most promoting, right? And I was like, well, that's a lot, but here's the problem. When I looked at the data itself, it turns out that of all racial groups, Black Americans have the highest percentage of that high category Christian nationalism.
That's interesting.
The highest one. And they even say that in their book in a one line. They're like, actually, of all racial groups, Blacks are the most supportive of Christian nationalism. And they have the smallest percentage of rejectors. So the highest percentage of, what are they called again?
Like adopters, acceptors.
No, it was one that is like proselytizers or something like that.
Yeah.
But basically, so according to their data and their way they characterize this, Blacks had the highest percentage of people who were very Christian nationalists or promoting it, and the smallest percentage of those who resisted it. I'm thinking that's not the narrative that really is being sold to us. And also their data shows that something like 6% of Jews are Christian nationalists according to their definition. And it was and I think only 30% of Christian nationalists didn't vote for Donald Trump in the last election.
I remember that number being higher than would.
And I was like, that's not. And then the data they were presenting was they were confusing people who are these rabid, they're people that actually they worship the United States. There are people like that.
Yeah.
They called those people Christian nationalists.
Okay.
They were also calling people Christian nationalists who say things like, their questions were like, should our laws be based on Christian values? If you answered like yes strongly to that notion, you get put in the Christian nationalist. That pushes you towards that end. Like, of course they should be based on Christian values. What other values are there? The only real moral values are Christian values because Christianity is true. So I think that they meant to say was uniquely Christian values. Like, should we become like theocracy? But the way the question was worded was ambiguous. My only point is this. That's an example of people saying, well, can we focus on Christian nationalism? I'm like, well, tell me exactly what you mean. If you mean that we ought to say, promote a totally secular basis for morality, and that you're going to call anything else Christian nationalism, I'm like, no, we shouldn't do that as Christians. We should want Christian values like opposition to racism to be part of our culture. That's a good thing. We should want protection for the unborn to be part of our culture and part of our laws. It's a good thing. Now, we can disagree as to what Christian values ought to be part of the law of the land. But my only point is that it's a great example of why don't you focus on this other issue? I would avoid labels and focus on ideas, because otherwise we end up, like you said, throwing everybody we don't like into this umbrella term and then blasting them, which is not helpful.
That's a fair critique of that book as I remember it. Like when I think of Christian values, some people are going to think of, well, love your neighbor.
Yeah.
Some think of the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
Think of the Good Samaritan versus what we mean by marriage. Like, is it all of it? Is it some of it? And the lack of clarification. So for you to say you're willing to critique these ideas if you see the data that it's embedded in the church, you have no problem with that, but have some issues with the way it's been presented, I think is fair. One question about CRT I want to bring you back to is, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, CRT seems to focus primarily on systems of oppression rather than culture or individual responsibility.
Yes.
So Kimberly Crenshaw said, quote, she was kind of using Thomas Sowell as a foil of somebody who doesn't understand racial dynamics today and fight it properly. She says, Thomas Sowell suggests that underclass blacks are economically depressed because they have not adopted the values of hard work and discipline. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, is it fair to say that there's one side who says the primary issue at play is systemic, and another side that says there may be systemic injustice, but the primary is culture and individual responsibility? Is that where the heart of the debate is? And how do you make sense of that idea as a Christian?
And that's one heart of the debate. I mean, like I said, they're all of these those four tenets have problems with all of them, but one of the the first one was racism is normal, permanent, and pervasive.
Yep.
So embedded in that way of thinking is that all of the preponderance of the racial disparities we see are due to systemic racism. Be careful here. How do you define that term? Well, critical race theorists define systemic racism as systems and policies which either promote or perpetuate racial disparities. Okay. But here's the problem. Again, that's how they define the term. If that's how you define systemic racism, does it exist? Yes. Okay, but are all policies that create, perpetuate racial disparities evil? No. Think about it. 1 second. Private property perpetuates wealth disparities. If you abolish private property, there's no wealth disparities. There's wealth anymore, right? Okay. So all your laws that protect private property, by their definition, are laws that promote systemic racism. And to abolish private property would be, therefore, anti-racist, because you'd be eliminating this wealth disparity. Okay. But we shouldn't think about laws that way. We should ask, what is good? What is a good and just law beyond whether it perpetuates disparities? I mean, and Abraham X. Kendi says explicitly, he says, if you think, he says, this I should quote this exactly. He says in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, says there are three sort of classes of ideas. Anti-racism says that all racial disparities in the U.S. and worldwide are solely the result of discrimination. He says that. That's anti-racism. Okay? There are two kinds of racists. Segregationist racists say that all racial disparities are a result of black, basically, inferiority. Right? Segregationist racist, okay? Which I think, obviously, that is racist. I think it's all inferiority. But assimilationist racism, he says, is thinking it's anything but all discrimination. So for him, the only way to be an anti-racist is to think all disparities are all discrimination. And any mixture of anything else, whether it's culture, whether it's individual choices, whether it's anything else, that is racism. He said that outright in his book, Stamped from the Beginning. And so I think, again, Kendi wouldn't say he's a critical race theorist. He would say he's been influenced heavily by people like Crenshaw.
Okay, that's fair.
But there is, you can see he's very explicit about it. And I would say Christians should definitely reject both extremes. Clearly, the disparities are not only discrimination. And Thomas Sowell has a whole book on this called Discrimination Disparities, where he goes through examples of just of neutral disparity. Like so, he talks about birth order. Like it's a really fascinating example of like the oldest child in a family is much more successful than the younger children.
Yeah.
But he's like, if you're going with the same household, same parents, same wealth, and yet you still see greater success and disparities because of birth order. That's not discrimination. That's just reality. Or he talks about how people living in mountainous regions are poorer and less educated than people in like the coastal regions all over the world. because it's access to like resources and cosmopolitanism. The point is that he just points out very rationally that not all discrimination, not all disparities are due to discrimination. So we should reject the idea that disparity equals discrimination. We should also reject, obviously, the idea that all disparities are just result of inferiority. I mean, no. I mean, obviously, think about it. In this country, we had, 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow. They're going to be, the legacy of those institutions they're going to be a legacy. They're going to linger, yeah. And so even if we completely got rid of all discrimination today, this instant, and it still exists obviously, but even if we did, there'd still be effects from our history, and so to ignore those is, I think, obviously wrong. So we can discuss the extent to which discrimination or legacy or various factors contribute to disparities. Let's have that discussion as Christians, as long as we reject the extremes.
Okay, so as a Christian, it's clear the scripture has a lot of talk about individual responsibility. Yeah. But it's also, if we are sinful and Romans 3 and Mark 7 is right, how deeply entrenched sin is, we shouldn't be surprised to see sin infecting systems. And especially, take the issue of abortion.
Yeah.
Clearly, systemic injustice, obvious. So at its core, am I hearing you saying you believe the Bible teaches individual responsibility, and we shouldn't be surprised? In fact, we should expect to see some racial injustice that's a result of racism. But your concern with CRT is it assumes it's always present.
That's the core tenet.
And the soul or core tenet, that's where you give pause.
That is the words they use. It's normal, permanent, pervasive. And Robin DiAngelo will say things like, DiAngelo is a critical race educator. It's on her website. Okay, people say she's not a critical race theorist. She says she's a critical race educator. Okay, and if you read her writing, she's clearly doing CRT. Okay. But she says things like, every interaction you have, the question is not, she says, this is a quote, the question is not, was this racism? But rather, how did racism manifest in this context? So literally everything you do, every interaction you have, is racism. The question is only how. She says in her book, White Fragility, she says that racism is present within every interracial friendship. Every one. It's never absent, right? I'm thinking, honestly, think about this. What if I'm half Indian. Was there is there still some racism going on between my white mom and my Indian dad? That's just a poisonous way of viewing reality. And it'll destroy the church if we let that kind of thinking into the church, where you assume racism is there, then you try to find it. It's a similar approach they're taking. They're not saying, like abortion. We would say, obviously, abortion it's enshrined into law. It's also enshrined into culture. The people thinking wrongly about abortion in the unborn, and they're being influenced by the media. They're being influenced by their peers. They're being influenced by So it's a and we want to change hearts and laws, both. We don't want to just change hearts or just change laws. We want to aim for both, and we can do both. So, but where critical race theory goes wrong is assuming that all of those things, there is hidden racism, and it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And then excavating it and seeing these subtle ways in which it's you find it in everything. And that's dangerous because it's based on, I think, a false premise, which is that it is everywhere. I think, and I would really hope that a white wife and her black husband, or an Asian husband and his black wife, or that they can be like, no, we love each other, and yes, we're sinners still, but I don't think you're inferior because you're not the same race. Race is a social construct, but whatever. But race is, that's not the right way to see our relationships, especially in the church.
What's the solution that critical race theory gives to recognizing racism? Because when I read a lot of the writings, I'm like, oh, they're recognizing racism. They want justice. There's a lot of things we want in common. But I get the impression that critical race theory isn't just a descriptive discipline. It's prescriptive. Yes. Let's fix this, which, as an academic, a lot of academics are not activists. Sometimes you have activists or you have academics. It seems like critical race theory is a very activist kind of approach to race. What is the solution, and how does it differ from what you think Christian solution is to racism?
So quick point, that is actually one of the two reasons why critical race theory emerged out of critical legal studies. Their objection to critical legal studies, which is the forerunner legal movement, was that they were not activist enough. the CRTs said, you guys are just these Ivy Tower intellectuals sitting around doing nothing.
Wow.
We want to take it to the streets.
Wow.
So part of and critical social theories in general do aim towards what's called praxis. They do not want to just describe the world. Harkening back to Karl Marx, their aim is to transform it. That's they don't want to just do this armchair philosophy. Anyway, that's an aside, but a very good point. It's absolutely right. One of the main critiques of CRT from other legal scholars from the 90s was that you don't have any constructive arguments. It's all destructive. And that's not my criticism. That is legal scholars, liberals who didn't like critical race theory said, look, all you do is tell us to tear everything down. You never offer us a positive thing to do except to tear down these oppressive structures. I think that today still is a fair criticism. If you think about, and oftentimes the solutions are always tentative. It's not like if you do this, it will fix things. It's this, we're going to do this, but then if we do this and 5 years later it doesn't work, we'll just do something else. We don't question our theory. We just do something else then. It's very pragmatic in that it's always aiming to revolutionize the system, to dismantle the system, to create an utopian system. And it's pretty impervious to empirical, like, oh, it didn't work. Maybe you should question your theory. It's like, no, we'll just keep hammering. We have the assumption that it's everywhere, it's normal, it's permanent, pervasive. We'll just keep tearing things down, and then one day we'll get it right and it'll be utopia. And I mean, an example from our popular discourse would be defund the police. Now, some people will say, well, they don't really mean defund the police, but you'll find people who say, no, we mean abolish the police. We mean get rid of it totally, no police anymore. And again, that's an extremist view, sure. But you see, again, it's not like they're not really well thought out policy solutions. It's not this immediate knee-jerk, let's just dismantle stuff. Because anything's better than oppression, sort of, I guess, the idea. Okay. I would say that in terms of thinking biblically, we have to realize that tearing stuff down is dangerous, and we should approach things with prudence and wisdom. And so, just identifying a problem and then just basically, if you're taking a hammer and smashing stuff and hoping it gets fixed, it's a very dangerous thing to do. I mean, actually, I saw today, Portland their murder rate doubled in the last year. Wow. And I think, you don't know exactly why, but part of it probably was like the protests against police and defunding the police, these movements to basically say policing is a problem. Well, their murder rate's doubled. It's doubled already, and it's only October, so we have a few more months left. So the bottom line is that from its inception, the criticism of CRT was that it's just a negative criticism. It's never producing positive solutions. And I think for Christians, one thing that we need to do is model constructive solutions and also model actually listening to both sides and trying to find a solution that people can agree with, building consensus. My friend George Yancey, he's written a lot about racial issues, he's a sociologist, but he really emphasizes that in the church, for example, we need to have a model based on active listening where we have the two sides getting together, the people on different perspectives on this discussion, and needed to, in collaboration, have a solution that everybody is invested in, everyone agrees to. You can't have like one side just dictating the solution to the other side.
That makes sense.
Because first of all, one side just made it bitter, or they might just leave. We want to. I know, like sometimes activists just want their way or the highway, but in the church it's not workable, right? We have to under the authority of Scripture, we have to find compromises because we're family. We can't afford to just be like, you know what, just leave. We'll have it our way. And obviously there's biblical guidelines. We can't, you can't just say we're going to do unbiblical things and dangerous things. But I think there's areas for compromise, and people have to be open to that. The difficulty is that critical race theory would see compromise as a manifestation of white supremacy. There's a reason for that. So,
interesting.
Their second tenet is racism is concealed beneath colorblindness, meritocracy, whatever.
Okay.
I won't go into details, but their idea is that the way that whites maintain racial power is by making strategic concessions, by compromising. Okay. So whites make compromises that allow them to retain their power and their privilege. So actually, this goes back to Derek Bell. The bottom line is that CRT will undermine the approach to trying to achieve consensus, because one of its premises is that consensus building is a way that racists maintain power. So that's going to scuttle your efforts.
When you talked about CRT being kind of a deconstruction movement
Yes.
that tears down, obviously part of that are Marxist ideas that's revolutionary. I also think as I read a lot of CRT scholars, there's a lot of hurt that's there. And when you're hurt and you see pain, sometimes we just grasp at anything that'll fix it. And I think sometimes as Christians, maybe we've just gone after and critiqued ideas, but not asked, okay, where is this coming from? How do I humanize this person and help heal the pain without giving into ideas that we think are oftentimes destructive? I don't know that we always do that well. You've had a lot of conversations with people, because I think you're trying to do this. You're listening to both sides. I've heard you say in many interviews how important it is to be charitable towards people. Since you've been public and you've been writing and having conversations, have your view shifted at all on CRT or just how to approach race?
I think I have actually become more convinced that CRT is fundamentally wrong and dangerous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The more I've studied it, the more I'm like, no, it's not just the things they say, explicitly, which are bad, but even the underlying assumptions they're making about things like power, justice, oppression, those are bad. I have a paper coming out hopefully soon with by a guy with an MDiv and a law degree, writing about CRT as a legal movement. Just the legal part of it.
Wow.
And showing that the premises on which it treats the law, just the law, not even culture or society, but even that part of CRT is just deeply dangerous. They basically just reject the idea of natural law wholesale. They reject the idea of a divine lawgiver. Like it's a sort of premise of their legal reasoning, but we won't get into that. So that I've definitely, I think, become more convinced of. But at the same time, in reading a lot of these books by CRT authors and by other people writing about race from a progressive perspective, what I have become to appreciate is how deeply wicked our nation's past is. That is something I knew it, right? But reading just these narratives and stories and firsthand accounts from newspapers. I mean, these are not like some scholars spinning. This is like, well, this newspaper said this about the lynching that just happened. It's horrific. It really is awful. And I think we have to tread a very fine line between buying into a certain narrative, which I think is, again, oftentimes driven by CRT, which is dangerous.
Yeah.
And then I think the others swing the other way and say, because that narrative is out there and it's dangerous, I'm going to just ignore this stuff. I'm like, no, we can't do that either, because it's just true. I mean, it's history. You can't just ignore history. It's there. It happened to us. It happened in our nation. And I think it is a chance for us, again, as you said, for people that are hurting, we can say, let me try to understand where you're coming from, and let me actually also realize that I have read these stories too. I haven't experienced the things you have, but I can sympathize with this history, and I also abhor it. I also lament it happened. So I think that does build bridges. Like, people even saying, "Oh, you've read that book." Yeah, they're like, "Oh, I didn't realize that." Like my friend Pat also has said, like when he tells people he's read like Ta-Nehisi Coates, that's often a source, or James Baldwin, or a lot of these other Black authors. They're moved by that. You took the time to read those people. Even if you disagree with some of the things they said, he's taken the time to do that. And that means a lot to them. So I think that's, again, an area where I feel like I would, this Jones book, going back to it, I wish I could take all of the historical parts of it and just take that out and say, read this stuff, because this is worth knowing.
Okay. Neil, I sure appreciate it, man. All the sense I've gotten from the beginning when I watch you and interact with you is that you want to be biblical, fiercely committed to truth, but also want to be charitable and gracious towards people who see the world differently. I've enjoyed a lot of the dialogues that you've had, and I can't even guess how many hours you put in of research into this. I know what it's like to research something. It's got to be hundreds, if not thousands. So I appreciate the work that you've put into this. Tell viewers how they can follow you, whether it's YouTube, your blog. How can they stay in touch with what you're coming up with next? On Twitter, you have a great Twitter feed.
Yeah, the best way probably is, or the worst way, I guess, is Twitter. which I'm on way too much, but my handle is at Neil Shenvi, Neilshenvi, and I have a website, shenvyapologetics.com, and I have lots of, mainly book reviews lately. I think it's the easiest way to engage fairly is not with these grand ideas, but look, here's a book I read, and here's quotes from it, and here's what I think about it. It's harder for people to even accuse you of getting that wrong because you're like, well, here are the quotes, they said this. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff I have online, so go ahead and check it out.
There you have it. Twitter at Neil Shenvi, neilshenvi.com.
No, it's shenvyapologetics.com.
Like I said,
just Google Neil Shenvi. There's like one of me in the world. So
there you go. That's true with the spelling. Shenvyapologetics.com. And while you're at it, make sure you hit subscribe because we've got some other interviews coming up you're not going to want to miss. This is brought to you by Biola Apologetics. If you've ever thought about getting a degree in apologetics, we are fully distanced and consistently the top-rated apologetics program. And we've actually had a class this year. One of my colleagues, Scott Smith, taught one kind of on critical theory, very, very carefully and thoughtfully. This is one of many issues that we engage at Biola. So thanks for coming on and for wearing a Captain America shirt. You outdressed me on my own show. Now you'll know why we'll never have him back. Just kidding. You're coming back. Thanks for hanging out, Neil.
Thank you.